The courtroom had reached its moment of reckoning, and though the verdict had already thundered through the federal halls with the weight of weeks of testimony, the day was far from over. Sean Diddy Combs stood acquitted on the most serious charges: racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking involving Cassie, Ventura, and Jane. But the split verdict hit with just as much force. Guilty on 2 counts under the Mann Act. Transportation for the purposes of prostitution. It was a jarring conclusion that left the public and legal analysts alike parsing every frame, every word, every breath. The government, having pursued a sweeping racketeering case with ambitions of setting precedent, now pivoted quickly, locking in its argument that detention must remain in effect as the sentencing phase loomed. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of a man who leveraged wealth, power, and intimidation in ways that far exceeded what the charges alone conveyed. The defense countered that a year already spent behind bars, coupled with a lack of prior convictions, warranted leniency and immediate release. But the judge wasn't swayed. Bail was denied, and the court would take no position yet on sentencing, though the ranges 21 to 27 months per the defense, 51 to 61 per the government began to crystallize what awaited. Outside the courthouse, emotion turned to chaos as supporters chanted, tempers flared. Baby oil was bizarrely sprayed in a moment that captured the circus-like spectacle of this trial. Inside, behind secured doors and solemn decorum, courtroom reporter Elizabeth Milner detailed a scene where Diddy had mouthed a soft thank you to the jury, where family members quietly celebrated a partial win, and where the judge reminded everyone that domestic violence and post-trade actions factored heavily into this narrative. The pre-sentencing report would soon unfold an excavation of history, habits, and harm that would frame the next act. Letters poured in, Cassie, Ventura's attorney, urging the court not to release a man she still feared. Deontay Nash warning of the continued threat Diddy posed. And while the U.S. attorney issued a restrained, victim-centered statement, the silence about the acquittals spoke volumes. In all of this, Diddy remained locked in MDC Brooklyn, awaiting a remote hearing scheduled for July 8, the sentencing tentatively set for October 3. The trial was technically over, but in spirit, it was only beginning to settle into its legacy, a culture-defining reckoning not just with fame, but with the cost of unchecked control. The pressure around the sentencing date began to crystallize into its own storm, with October 3 marked on the calendar, a date oddly immortalized in pop culture, but now cemented for reasons far graver. The battle turned procedural. Behind the sealed doors of MDC Brooklyn, Sean Diddy Combs remained confined, but outside, the court docket grew louder. July 8 would bring the remote hearing. One the defense desperately hoped could shift the narrative toward expedited sentencing. Mark Agnifilo, animated and unyielding, argued that Diddy had already served nearly a year, and time was now the punishment, not the justice. He requested that interviews with probation officers and bureaucratic delays be waived, advocating that the court had witnessed every relevant piece of this man's life over the weeks-long trial, but the judge showed no movement. The prosecution, stoic and deliberate, emphasized that haste wasn't justice, was a risk. They reminded the court of Diddy's alleged brazenness, his continued drug use, and acts of violence even after the 2024 raids. They cited post-charge incidents involving Jane, painted a portrait of a defendant who, in their words, wielded control as a weapon, and reiterated the severity of his convictions under the Mann Act. What followed was a chorus of witnesses adding their voices. Cassie, Ventura's counsel, called Diddy a continuing danger. Deontay Nash warned the court of fear that hadn't faded, but festered. All while outside, his supporters screamed his innocence, pressed phones to glass, and argued in real time over the justice system's ability to be both fair and final. The defense rebutted passionately. They compared Diddy's charges to other cases: massaging parlor operators, pimps with profits in the millions, even a former governor untouched by the law. Mark pointedly asked, was Diddy truly more dangerous than those men? But comparisons couldn't erase what had already been seen and heard. The judge remained steady. No bail, no shortcuts, no promises. And Diddy still behind federal glass waited, the myth of invincibility dimming with every passing hearing. As the courthouse prepared for the remote July 8 hearing, everything grew cold. Though the physical presence of Sean Diddy Combs would not fill the courtroom, his shadow stretched long across the proceedings. The judge, ever conscious of precedent and pressure, signaled he would weigh every element, not just the verdict, but the pattern. The prosecution submitted additional filings, reinforcing their stance that Diddy's post-conviction behavior showed no signs of reform or remorse. They cited new evidence of encrypted communications with former staff discussing the possibility of rebuilding narratives post. It wasn't a legal ad, but it rattled the notion of contrition. Meanwhile, the defense doubled down on their push for a sentence below federal guidelines. They leaned hard on character witnesses, industry figures, community leaders, even former partners who, while silent during trial, now penned glowing letters about his mentorship, philanthropy, and impact. They submitted documentation of Diddy's mental health treatment behind bars and referenced his daily compliance with MDC staff. Still, the tension refused to ease. Anonymous sources whispered that at least one juror, since released, had privately expressed regret that the emotional weight of the trial had caused certain pieces to feel muted in real time. That admission, unconfirmed and off the record, rippled through the defense team like adrenaline. But it wasn't enough to undo what was already sealed in record. Inside the legal teams, fatigue turned to calculation. The government sought to ensure no leniency could be spun into momentum. The defense maneuvered to package Diddy's future in months, not years. But the judge, he read everything, every letter, every case comparison, every detail, and he said nothing. Because what was coming wasn't about persuasion anymore. It was about posture. On October 3rd, when the sentencing would be handed down, whether in a hushed courtroom or before a sea of flashing cameras, it wouldn't be Diddy's fame on trial. It would be the federal justice system's answer to one question. How do you sentence a man who was powerful enough to weaponize silence, but not strong enough to outrun it? As the days ticked toward October 3rd, each sunrise over Brooklyn brought with it a new layer of anticipation and dread. MDC's walls, once anonymous to the public, became symbols of a pause and empire. A place where someone like Diddy, once untouchable, sat in the quiet hours recalculating the terms of legacy. Legal analysts flooded networks, speculating on sentencing outcomes. Would the judge send a message? Or would he balance the fame with the facts and the years already served? The courtroom buzzed with quiet prep. The probation office finalized its pre-sentencing report, painting a full complex portrait. A man of enormous influence, philanthropic reach, undeniable charisma, and a hidden pattern of control and manipulation. Family members arrived early that day, seated behind the defense table. Cassie Ventura was not there. Jane was not there. But their absence said everything. Victims didn't need to be in the room to make the silence feel full. The judge entered without ceremony. No one breathed. He spoke with clarity, acknowledging the split verdict, the contradictions, the absence of mandatory minimums, and the depth of public interest. Then he looked directly at Diddy. Not as a performer, not as a defendant, but as a man. You've built an empire, he said, but you also built a system that exploited people under the illusion of consent and celebrity. This court does not sentence fame, it sentences actions. And then came the numbers. 57 months. Just under 5 years. Credit for time served. Conditions set. Probation to follow. Travel restricted. Diddy did not flinch. His eyes barely moved, but his hands folded tight betrayed the full storm within. His attorneys exhaled, not with joy, but with the dull relief of finality. And when the gavel struck, the noise wasn't sharp, it was weighty, like a final beat on a record that could no longer spin. Outside, the crowds had thinned, the cameras remained, but the narrative had shifted. No longer did he do it. Now, what happens to a legacy when the silence ends? As the courtroom emptied and the press began filing their reports, a strange quiet followed Diddy out of the room. Not applause, not protest, just the heavy silence of reckoning. He walked with his head level, shoulders squared, not with pride but with resignation. The same man who once floated through red carpets and private jets now moved like someone who knew every step forward was being measured. Outside, the waiting vans idled, security flanked him with a practiced shield. And for a moment, it felt like the world paused, not out of respect, but curiosity. Who is this man now? A convicted felon, yes, but also a symbol of a system cracking under the weight of its own secrets. Reporters shouted questions. He didn't answer. His family followed behind, their faces tight with emotion. And as he entered the vehicle, pulling the door shut behind him, it wasn't closure that settled but the beginning of something else. A long, uncertain stretch where every whisper, every document, every victim's testimony echoed louder than any beat he had ever produced. The empire hadn't fallen in one day. But the myth of its invincibility, though, was gone. Behind the dark tint of the SUV windows, Diddy sat still, not speaking, his reflection in the glass staring back at him like a stranger. The murmurs of family, the occasional buzz of a phone, the shuffle of legal documents all blurred into a kind of static. No entourage, no stage lights. Just the sharp truth that legacy, when tainted, does not glitter. As the vehicle pulled into traffic, escorted discreetly by federal security, the streets outside, whence his playground now looked foreign. Anonymous faces pressed to barricades. Protesters in pockets, some shouting support, others spitting rage. It was all their chaos, curiosity, disbelief, and none of it mattered now, because the true noise wasn't out there, it was inside. In his head, every decision replayed, every ignored warning. Every thread pulled until the whole cloth came undone. A voice memo, a spreadsheet, a look from a juror that said more than a verdict ever could. He wasn't going back to his old life, not in the way he once knew it. Whether in prison or free on limited terms, the world had changed its gaze. The narrative had slipped from his grip. The next chapter, if there would be one, would be written not with handlers or hits, but with scrutiny, limits, and the shadow of consequences finally catching up. At MDC Brooklyn, the cell door closed with a finality that no courtroom gavel could match. Diddy sat on the edge of the cot, elbows on knees, fingers pressed together, listening to the silence that now defined his world. No music, no negotiations, no shield of celebrity. Just the soft hum of institutional air and the distant clink of someone else's future unraveling in a cell nearby. His mind cycled through the faces: Cassie's trembling voice on the stand, Jane's tears behind cross-examination, the steely stillness of the judge as he read the record aloud. These weren't just players in a courtroom drama. They were echoes now, carved into the structure of what came next. And what came next was sentencing. October 3rd, the date burned in his mind. Not a release date, not an album drop, a judgment. One that would not be shaped by influence or image, but by words he himself had spoken, by documents he had once buried, by truths that no longer needed proving. He wasn't thinking about lawyers anymore. He was thinking about the weight of years, about how time bends inside a cell, and how, sometimes, the longest sentence isn't written on paper but in the quiet acknowledgement that for all the power he once held, he couldn't undo what had already been seen. There was no next move now, only waiting. In the weeks that followed, as the world turned and headlines faded into the next scandal, the cell remained constant. Diddy's lawyers filed motions, submitted pre-sentencing memoranda, highlighted his philanthropic efforts, his lack of prior convictions, his contributions to the culture. But those papers didn't echo in the way his voice had, captured on tape.com and damning. The prosecution sharpened its final arguments too, pointing to the scale of manipulation, the exploitation buried beneath wealth, the damage left behind. They spoke not just of punishment, but of precedent, how even the powerful must answer when the evidence becomes undeniable. The pre-sentencing investigation unfolded quietly. Officials met with former employees, read sealed records, traced payments and patterns. They interviewed victims. They didn't ask if he was famous. They asked what kind of man he had been when no one was watching. And as October approached, the city around that courthouse braced again, not for spectacle, but for closure. Because sentencing wasn't just an endpoint, it was a reckoning, long delayed, finally arrived. On the morning of October 3rd, the courtroom was silent. Not from lack of attention, but from the kind of stillness that only arrives when everyone knows something irreversible is about to happen. New Magia Circus. No chants. Just federal agents, court clerks, family members, victims, and a few worn-out reporters who had followed every step of this trial like a slow, grim march. Diddy entered in the same beige correctional uniform he had worn for months. Now, the man who once commanded arenas now walked with the gait of someone who measured time in seconds and surveillance. His lawyers sat stiffly, folders stacked in neat piles that felt more like ritual than readiness. The judge, eyes weary but focused, opened the session with deliberate care. Today, he said, this court does not sentence a persona, a brand, or an icon. It sentences a man, based solely on evidence, testimony, and law. As he spoke, the room leaned in, not because they didn't know the outcome was coming, but because they needed to hear how far the fall would reach. The prosecution read their final statement.com, brutal. He orchestrated, enabled, and benefited from the exploitation of women across state lines. He used power as a shield. The jury may have found insufficient evidence for certain charges, but they found the truth where it counted. Then came the defense, softer, pleading. Mr. Combs has already lost his career, his freedom, and the legacy he spent a lifetime building. We asked this court to remember mercy, and the difference between a life sentence and a life reformed. The judge listened, and then, without theatrical pause, he delivered the sentence. Sean Combs, for your conviction on counts 3 and 5, this court sentences you to 58 months in federal custody. You will be credited for time already served. You will be subject to supervised release upon completion, and you are hereby ordered to register under the Federal Sex Offender Registry as required by statute. The courtroom did not erupt. It simply breathed out, a collective exhale after a year of watching someone with everything slowly run out of exits. Diddy didn't move at first. Then slowly, he nodded just once, his eyes glassy. Not from tears, but from recognition. The game was over. The system, flawed as it was, had spoken. Outside the courthouse, the world had already shifted. The sidewalk press line buzzed, not with shouts, but with the flicker of phones, subdued murmurs, and the hollow weight of resolution. There were no cheers, no triumphant exits, just a black van idling near the curb, waiting for a man who had once flown private jets and walked red carpets, but now needed federal escort to his next destination. Inside, the judge stood, gave a final nod to the court clerk, and exited through a door few had ever noticed before. Diddy was led out the opposite way, not in cuffs, but closely flanked by U.S. Marshals. He didn't look back, not at his family seated quietly in the gallery, not at the reporters, not at the faces he used to know. His lawyer patted his shoulder briefly, more a gesture of completion than comfort. The courtroom began to clear, benches creaking with each tired step of those who had waited so long for this moment and found it strangely hollow. Cassie Ventura was not present that day, but her statement, sent through counsel, was read aloud into the record before adjournment. I came forward not for revenge, but for recognition. Today is not justice, but it is acknowledgement. And sometimes, that is the only place we can begin. The final entry in the record was made. The case of United States v. Sean Combs was officially closed. And just like that, a saga that had gripped headlines, fueled protests, fractured loyalties, and shaken the illusion of untouchable power came to its quiet end, not with a roar, but with a gavel, and the sound of footsteps down a government hallway, one echo at a time. There was no press conference, no closing statement from the defense, no final wave from Diddy's legal team, just a closing door, marked authorized personnel only, and the sound of that final latch clicking shut behind him. Outside, the crowds began to in disbelief, others with vindication, many simply numb. A few supporters clung to signs, holding them a little higher, as if to push back against the verdict by sheer will. But most people just walked away slowly, heads bowed, eyes glazed, processing the enormity of what they had witnessed. For years, Diddy had been a fixture of music, of business, of culture, a man who shaped narratives, built empires, and moved through scandal like it was background noise. But now, the myth had collapsed under its own weight. The final camera crews began to pack up, rain lightly tapping against their gear, a thin drizzle beginning to sweep across the courthouse steps. Somewhere, a security officer called out for people to clear the walkways. A woman sobbed quietly near the edge of the barricades. And as the black van pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the thrum of New York City traffic, there were no sirens, no applause, no closure. Only the long, gray silence of accountability. After the intense and tightly wrung bail hearing, the courtroom descended into a hush so profound it felt like a living organism holding its breath. Combs sat rigid, the years of crafted image stripped to raw vulnerability. His lawyers exchanged glances, some strained hope, some suppressed regret as the government's argument echoed in the quiet. A man with convictions on 2 counts, involving forced transportation, with admitted violence and drug involvement, could not be trusted back into society. As the defense pressed for compassion, citing a year already spent in custody and proposing firm travel restrictions and financial guarantees, you could almost taste the tension, thick and metallic. The judge, stone-faced and unwavering, reminded the courtroom of legal mandates and systemic obligations, reminding everyone present that sentencing considerations would await a full pre-sentencing report. The Judges.com finally edged with clarity. Combs would remain in custody. Behind the bench, scribbling clerk, unspeaking bailiffs, and observant jurors, though jurors would not be carried the weight of this decision in their posture and their silence. When the gavel fell again, not in victory but in order, Combs exhaled slowly, more silently, and the court rose, everything echoing against marble walls. Outside, the press clamored louder, the crowd thickened, but inside, only the quiet shuffle of legal paperbacks marked the end of today's chapter. Yet the story wasn't over. Sentencing awaited, date etched on the calendar October 3rd. With a remote conference looming, July 8th, to determine how many more chapters this case would claim from the life of a man who once seemed untouchable. The courtroom emptied, almost ceremoniously, each step echoing in the vast, ornate hall, as Combs was escorted back to his holding cell, a procession that, for once, didn't feel triumphant but consequential. Reporters and spectators spilled into the hallways, smartphones clutched like evidence of the days to come. Conversations revolved tightly around the split verdict, the precedent it set, and the looming question of what Combs truly faced on October 3rd. Somewhere in the distance, muffled debates flared about whether this conviction would define his legacy, more than any chart-topping album or empire-building move he'd ever accomplished. By late afternoon, a hush descended over the chambers once more, this time for a procedural hearing meant to address outstanding motions, requests for sealed documents to remain under wraps, objections to defense counsel's proposed witness testimony on sentencing mitigation, and last-minute filings from the prosecution urging that the convict's behavior after arrest further undermined any justification for clemency. Witnesses weren't present. This hearing felt like legal triage and administrative heartbeat, yet the stakes were just as potent. Attorneys leaped in with precision, defense counsel highlighting Combs's charitable work, long-term partnerships, and personal recovery efforts, while prosecution reminded the court of the gravity of orchestrating cross-state prostitution and the violence admitted on the record. Throughout it all, Judge Matthews' steadfast and silent absorbed objections, rulings, and proposed stipulations. With precise rhythm, he granted some motions, denied others, and instructed parties to submit final sentencing memoranda by mid-August, laying the groundwork for the October hearing. It's in that no man's land between conviction and sentencing the most strategic battles play out, Will Combs's legacy of philanthropy and cultural impact outweigh the violence and manipulation the court now concluded beyond a reasonable doubt? Outside, as dusk settled on Manhattan, the final shots of the day were fired, not in court but on social media. Free Diddy hashtags trended in waves, some earnest, some defiant. But so did stories of those impacted by his crimes. Tributes to Ventura and Jane, analyses of case law, and heated speculation about whether he'd serve time or walk free under plot twists few could predict. And somewhere in that maelstrom, Combs's legal team began building a counter-narrative, picking through transcripts, highlighting positive character references, and drafting a roadmap for his release that narrowly evaded kitchen sink strategies. Meanwhile, a timeline began to crystallize. July 8th, remote conference. Sentencing materials due Midogast. Sentencing, October 3rd. And after that, a reckoning that would reverberate far beyond courtroom walls, through record labels, news, and public opinion. For now, the man once known only as Diddy sat behind bars, awaiting a future as uncertain as it was inevitable. The empire he built felt fragile without the shield of his voice, his presence, his control. And in that silence, more than any verdict or bail ruling, more than hashtags or sealed motions, the true weight of today's proceedings pressed down. A reckoning not just with the justice system, but with a legacy long shrouded in power, persuasion, and mythology. The story far from over. The courtroom closed for now, but the echo of October 3rd already whispering of finality. The quiet after the procedural hearing was almost deafening. No cameras, no courtroom drama, just the soft click of pens and papers being stacked. As Judge Matthews adjourned and rose from the bench, the collective breath of every legal player in that room exhaled in unison. Behind him, defense counsel lingered over the well-worn carpet, exchanging final glances with prosecutors. No one rushed. This moment wasn't about movement, it was about gravity. For Combs, still escorted in the midst of it all, the weight of his surroundings pressed heavily. Not the fear of conviction, but the stark realization that his fight was far from over. Just outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with hushed intensity. Journalists and legal analysts clustered beneath the cavernous ceiling, furiously on calls, others tapping updates into live feeds. A shared wave of speculation rippled through the crowd. Would the October 3rd sentencing signal the end of Diddy's dominion, or open a glimmer of redemption? Attorneys spoke softly, weighing the push and pull of sentencing guidelines, community impact statements, and media fallout. Every nuance mattered. The number of letters submitted, the community service highlighted, the timing of that 2016 Instagram post invoked by the judge. It all had a ripple effect, even before any ruling. Later that evening, Combs's legal team reconvened behind closed doors, poring over case law and pre-sentencing reports. Their objective, to craft a narrative that could offset the stain of violence and racketeering allegations. They pulled in character witnesses from his philanthropic circles, reached out to empty nester mothers impacted by his charity drives, even contacted musicians who credited him with mentoring them. Meanwhile, the prosecution locked in their exhibits, transcripts, victim testimony, police reports, and digital trails that painted a stark and cautionary portrait of unchecked power. By dusk, the wheels were already in motion. Bridget callouts to the probation office scheduled. Final witness lists trimmed. Sentencing memoranda carefully polished, every line measured for impact. But beyond the courthouse walls, a different arena was taking shape. Podcasts rehearsed talking points about the severity of his crimes. Newsrooms primed investigations into the shell companies mentioned during testimony. Social media became a battleground of hashtags, and the hashtagged voices ranged from outraged survivors demanding justice to loyal fans offering empathy to a creator gone off script. And amid it all, the looming dates began to shine sharp. July 8th remote conference, a technical yet pivotal moment. Mid-August, a deadline for briefs that would define the scope of the final fight. October 3rd, the day the gavel would fall, not only on Combs's fate but on how Diddy would go down in history, as a titan undone or a spokesperson redeemed. For now, the silence of the courtroom swelled with unspoken questions. Could power survive, offset not by conviction but by crackdown? Could exile, legal, social, self-imposed, be redeemed by legacy work? Would October bring closure or ignite echoes that none of his rhythms could drown out? The answers waited behind locked doors and hand-stamped envelopes. But today's proceedings, cleansed of performances or proclamations, left one truth undeniable. The empire Diddy built was no longer just his. To command it was subject to the cold arithmetic of law. And that reckoning, scheduled for the seasons to come, would define not just what he did, but who, if anyone, he became afterward. The courthouse doors closed behind the press well into the evening. But the ripple effect of the day's proceedings refused to fade. Inside, staff began tallying the letters submitted to the court, countless pages chronicling fears, pleas, and character testimonies that would soon find their way into official sentencing filings. Among them, lawyers discussed whether to introduce fresh evidence of Combs's charitable work, drawing lines between altruism and accountability. By nightfall, the Diddy camp had assembled a digital dossier, clips of mentorship programs, testimonials from artists he helped launch, even excerpts from interviews reflecting his philanthropic ambitions. Their goal was clear pushback against the narrative of a fallen mogul by illuminating how deeply entangled he's been in construction of community uplift. Meanwhile, prosecutors responded to leaks in media with pointed clarifications: the bail denial, the 2 convictions, and the need for public safety to outweigh public relations. And though Combs remained unseen in Brooklyn's MDC, the public saw his silhouette in headlines, avatars, podcasts, and encrypted group chats. Conspiracy theorists debated the fairness of his high-profile trial. Victims' advocates rallied on social media. Financial analysts began re-evaluating his business empire, anticipating the impact of a multi-year sentence. Lawyers from rival camps studied sentencing memos, searching transcripts for any language bolstering their own clients'. Legal scholars watching. Always watching. Soon, July 8th loomed, the remote scheduling conference. Though procedural, the outcome could shift the timeline, condensing the months of preparation and debate into a whirlwind final sprint. The courtroom's clinical atmosphere had vanished, replaced by strategic furnace behind the scenes. The defense and prosecution traded motions late into the night by email and motion, each seeking advantage in earlier hearing date, a narrower scope for victim impact statements, or additional character affidavits. Close to midnight, members of the defense team broke away to strategize their next public messaging campaign: press releases, selective interviews, a humanizing portrait in the spotlight. Prosecutors began compiling victim impact affidavits to reinforce the gravity of the convictions. That simultaneous duality, offense and defense, preparing their closing narratives, underscored what was at stake beyond prison walls: the story that would endure. And so, as midnight approached, the narrative had already progressed far beyond that courtroom bench. In the legal realm, the script was shifting. October 3rd might bring a gavel strike, but July 8th would determine how swift, how narrow, how public that strike would be. The post-verdict hush had given way to relentless momentum, because in the world of high stakes combined with hyper-profile, even silence demands a response. And no matter where he was sitting next, Combs was in a fight to define the final chapters of his own legend.